Hello, we're here today with Christoph Werkmeister from Freshfields, a partner that has drafted with his team a study for Europe on the streamlining of the EU digital rulebook. Thanks a lot for joining us, Christoph.
Yeah, thanks, Konstantin, for having me.
So, to provide a little bit of context, where is this discussion happening here? The European Union currently is in a situation where, given the geopolitical context, there's much more focus again on competitiveness. And we've seen this now starting with the new mandate, the new political guidelines of President von der Leyen, and the Draghi report over the summer that has given the debate around simplifying or streamlining the policy framework in many industries actually a strong drive. Especially in the digital sector, I think we've now seen a discussion around simplifying the rules because these rules have actually grown quite a lot over the last couple of years and it has created some complexity. Maybe can you provide for the viewers and the listeners a little bit of context here?
Yeah, absolutely. For us as a law firm, this was an interesting challenge because what we did here was review the existing rule books that exist in the European Union and implemented across the member states, and look where do we see actual inconsistencies and where are like real redundancies. So we didn't look at the existing rule books from kind of a policy or lobbying perspective. So we are not the ones to judge like, yeah, are these laws good or bad? We just know for a fact from our practice that there has simply been a wave of new regulation, not just for the digital sector, but they are the biggest target of most of the new regulation. And then assess where do we actually have overlaps and what can be done going forward to make things maybe more efficient and more streamlined, which ultimately is also for the benefit not only of companies operating more effectively, but also at the end of the day for the end user.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe before we actually dive deeper into the content of some of these laws that you looked into, let's talk first a bit oversight. I think one situation that we've heard a lot about, also from our member companies, is that often companies face multiple regulators for the same issue, for the same service. Can you give us, shed some light on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the issue is that we not only have one regulation for the digital space, but it's multiple ones. So it starts with the protection of personal data that is governed by the GDPR. So this was in 2018 one of the main frameworks. However, that evolved and you now see, for example, in the area of digital content, the Digital Services Act, you see in terms of, for example, access to data, the Data Act, you see in terms of cybersecurity various new regimes, for example, the Cyber Resilience Act, the NIS2 Directive and others. And you see multiple new regulations which are either sector-specific or specific to certain kinds of services or products, like, for example, the AI Act regulating activities around AI. And you can imagine if you have a digital service, these services are not one-dimensional, but they touch upon multiple of these regulations. So if I have an online platform, of course, I'm processing personal data, so I'm, of course, subject to the GDPR. But at the same time, I'm also subject to the DSA, I'm subject to the AI Act to the extent I have AI capabilities, and so on and so forth. So I'm automatically, just by virtue of being a digital operator, subject to all these regulations. So what happened when all these regulations came into force? Well, they have to be enforced, and there have to be regulatory bodies overseeing this. And this was done in a way to say, yeah, for each of these regulations, you usually have specialized regulators, either on a member state level, which means you have across the 27 member states different regulators for different regulations, and also on a European Union level, for example, for very large online platforms or search engines, you have the European Commission as the oversight body under the DSA, and they're also regulating the DMA. However, there are many instances where they're not regulating. So you have to deal with multiple regulators, and given that all these laws are new and they actually tackle novel challenges in the digital sectors, there's often, a lot of room for interpretation. And it is just normal. It's human nature. You have different people sitting at different bodies in different member states, looking at the same regulation, but maybe coming to different conclusions. And given that all this regulation is new, there has to be certainly a regulatory dialogue. So you are, in fact, in touch with these regulators way more often than you would think. However, this regulatory dialogue also creates regulatory uncertainty for the companies and also regulatory risk, because there may be divergences in terms of how the regulators approach this. This is just, an example in terms of, engaging with regulators, which creates a huge issue. This is, of course, multiplied also because you have obviously local courts looking at all this regulation. And this is the particular thing, in terms of the governance, where we think there needs to be some kind of streamlining to ensure that companies are not caught between the chairs, dealing with all these different regulators, and at the end of the day, not getting more legal certainty, but just the opposite, having more legal uncertainty and not knowing how to design their products and how to set up themselves internally.
Okay, thanks. Let's look a little bit at the compliance journey of companies. And I think one common theme, a common obligation that we're seeing now more and more across the most recent laws, maybe starting with the GDPR at the time, is documentation and impact assessments. I think it's been a very common thing that we see scattered across laws now. The GDPR already required a impact assessment of companies when it comes to data processing. But we've now seen similar things with the DSA, with some of the sectorial laws. We've seen it with also with the AI Act now. Can you walk us a little bit through what's the challenge there for companies when they do these?
Yes. So first of all, all these regulations and the lawmakers, they had a certain aim in mind when imposing all these documentation standards and risk assessment obligations, because they wanted companies to be more accountable. So being able to evidence that they are compliant, and also giving the regulators and later courts, a solid basis to evaluate what these companies are doing. So you can say, well, there is actually a real purpose behind this. However, the way it evolved, given that we also have these multiple regimes, that actually ended up in a lot of bureaucracy, you could say, which doesn't necessarily add value in terms of how products are designed, how secure they are, or how risks are managed. And to give a few concrete examples, in terms of documentation, and documentation means like internal documentation, so what you as a company keep in your records, not for the public to see, but for regulators to assess. You have obligations under the GDPR, again, to ensure do I have a legal basis for my processing? Have I carried out my necessary risk assessments? But then again, also under other regulation, like the DSA, for example, there are quite burdensome regulations on conducting risk assessments. In this case, the question of is there a systemic risk in terms of, for example, harmful content being on the platform? Then under the AI Act, for example, you again have certain risk assessment obligations, and these must also flow into your AI risk management, so that you, for example, ensure that AI is not making decisions that can later on not be traced back to the original data. So it's about data accuracy, data governance, etc. The only question is, if you are an agile company operating under all these regulations, and you're, for example, developing a new service, or you're developing an enhancement of your existing service, maybe with the use of AI technology. And before you can do that, you must undergo a lot of documentation requirements, and you must conduct certain risk assessments, which like you would probably do anyway, but the way it needs to be presented so that it can later on also be fed to a regulator and also meet the regulatory requirements in terms of how it must be documented, that is quite burdensome and eats up a lot of capacity and slows down actually the process of developing these new products. And therefore, this was one of the particular aspects we looked at where we thought that there needs to be some simplification.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think especially when it comes then to reporting across the year, I think it's quite interesting that whenever the law has been adopted, that, so to say, sets then the timeline. And you might be reporting the same service or documenting for the same service in May, then again in August, and then maybe in November, just depending on when the law was adopted. And yeah, that creates probably some redundancies. Let's move on to the area of data processing, which is also one of your specialities. There with, I guess, with the Data Act, parts of the DMA, but also the GDPR underlying, of course, we also now have different regimes overlapping. Can you walk us through some of the issues we're facing there?
Yeah, so I think one very obvious discrepancy that we see and where a lot of companies actually struggle with is this divergence between the Data Act, which is a regulation that imposes on companies to make data accessible by design. So you must design a product to be open so that data can flow out to the user or to authorized third parties. And on the other hand, you have the GDPR, which basically provides you must minimize data, you must not share data where it's not necessary, you must have closed environments ideally because that is more secure. Also under other cybersecurity regulation that we just mentioned. So whenever you're designing a new product and you are subject to the Data Act, for example, you are constantly caught between a rock and a hard place because no matter what you do, it will and can be criticized because either you're not making enough data accessible or you're not minimizing your data enough, you're not keeping data secure enough. So that's an inherent conflict that hasn't actually been resolved in the regulation, but it's just open.
And I think it's also a scope question, because when you look at the GDPR, we're talking about personal data. The Data Act includes personal data, but also other data. And then I think under the DMA, I think you can move around profile data, which is probably a subset of personal data. So I think it becomes also complicated from the user perspective.
Absolutely. And then under the AI Act, for example, you also have requirements around data accuracy. So the data that is used for the purpose of your AI system must be accurate enough to produce accurate results. Yeah. So you have multiple obligations around data, to some extent personal data or non-personal data, and it all overlaps. And this makes it really difficult to assess, first of all, as you say, also the scoping, like, yeah, where am I actually in scope of these regulations? And if I do it very precisely, I'm also kind of tagging my data internally because if I have a piece of data that is subject to certain restrictions, then I must be able to know that, and I must have IT systems that actually support the visibility and then also implementing certain restrictions. And on the other hand, I may have certain obligations with regard to data. Again, it needs to be in my systems, and the law is just very general. It says like, yeah, you must do this for all the data. And the problem is, however, if you look at data-driven companies, we're talking about a lot of data. And also another example, in particular coming from the Data Act, is a lot of companies in the past have spent years to analyze very concretely what kind of personal data are we processing. And now, all of a sudden, they also have to trace what kind of non-personal data am I processing. Yeah. In the old world, you just did it, and you don't document it, you don't have registries, etc. Under the new world, the expectation seems to be like, oh, I also have to document this. Again, makes product development much harder.
Yeah, that's certainly a space which we probably could do a whole interview about just on its own. To make a bit of a jump in terms of content, let's get also to the content. I think the space around content moderation online is certainly one of the most complex ones. This all started with the e-commerce directive that set relatively basic rules around illegal content and its removal and the liabilities involved. But ever since, we've actually grown this space into I'd say, a very complex jungle of laws, starting with the copyright directive, but then also the platform to business regulation, then a couple of sectorial pieces, terrorist content, political advertising, and now, of course, just 2.5 years ago, the Digital Services Act. I guess I'm almost saying it right now. It is already quite complex with just a lot of regulations that apply. But can you shed some more light on how these things overlap and what frictions does that create in the day-to-day for companies?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you already say, it is simply a lot of regulation for a lot of different situations. But at the end of the day, it's all the content that is on online platforms. And there are some like nitty-gritties which, however, operationally make it very challenging for the companies to comply. One example, for example, is that you have on the one hand the DSA and then the copyright regulations. And, the one law says like certain content must be taken down without undue delay. The other law says like, yeah, but there must be an expedited process. And the question is, what does this mean now? Do I have a different standard? Mm-hmm. Must one go faster than the other? Or is there room to somehow align this? The problem is the laws just leave it open. And so as a company, you are set out to make your own business decisions on what you think is the right interpretation and the right reasonable approach for this to kind of streamline it. But it also exposes you to a certain risk, even though you want to do the right thing. Similarly, also, if you look at child sexual abuse under the CSAM regulation, again, obviously the aim here is the right direction, but the additional complexity it creates to have another framework for this particular content makes it, again, much more difficult to comply.
Before we close, maybe, do we have some recommendations also to policymakers who might be watching this going forward? Are there some conclusions you can also draw about how we make these laws and how we could maybe avoid some of these problems before they come about?
Yes, so this is something that we also gave a lot of thought about when doing the study, because obviously lawmaking is not easy. And obviously we're talking about very, very complex issues here. However, what you see in practice when these laws first get drafted and then discussed by the European Commission is that there are certain sections in the Commission, so-called DGs, who are kind of experts for the different areas. And you may have experts for personal data protection, you may have experts for communication or for financial services, etc. And they have the chance to chime in and to give comments. However, this only starts at the very beginning of the lawmaking process, and then the law evolves. And as you know best, there's going to be a lot of political discussion and laws and the draft proposals change. And then all of a sudden, there is not so much expert input anymore. And this is, I think, something that really needs to change, because it is, at the end of the day, the nitty-gritty is looking at how can this law impact another? Or is what we're trying to regulate here already regulated somewhere else? And are just creating something that's redundant. And also looking at just the operational impact. Oh, do I have a new regulator looking at something that's maybe different, but on the other hand, very similar to something that another regulator does? So all these questions should not just be fed in at the beginning, but really like throughout the whole process until the very end.
Yeah, I think we certainly see these problems also when we follow those legislative procedures. We know that in trialogues, sometimes the political pressure is very high to come to conclusions. But then again, there are sometimes significant changes at the very last minute. If you look at, for example, the DSA, the whole introduction of the oversight powers of the European Commission was actually a compromise in the political negotiations that probably did not receive much impact assessment before it was adopted. And those are, I think, some points we would like to see improved in the legislative process. Now, this has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for the conversation, Christoph. If you want to look into this study, we can find it online on our website. It's also linked probably below this video here. Thanks a lot for coming, Christoph.
Thank you, Konstantin.
Thanks.